Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and thank you for joining this session, the Oando Ask the Expert session. The topic of this session is devil in the detail and the rudiments of contract making and contract and deal making. Um, my name is Yomi Babalola. I'm the legal advisor for Oando PLC, and I will be taking you through this hopefully interesting session. Um, Now, thank you for tuning in again, and I hope at the end of the session, you would have gained significant insight into the rudiments of contracting, negotiation, and deal making. I think I should do a brief introduction of myself again. I started my career in 2007 in a law firm called Yomi Babalola Marina, where I did litigation and dispute resolution, property law practice, and conveyancing and company secretariat services to different companies. I also did a bit of, insolvency practice, liquidating some blue chip companies whilst at Akinwumi and Busari. Then I moved to Globalcom as a legal executive, where I got the opportunity to, work on some high net worth telecom contracts, financial transactions, and general support to supply chain. The telecom sector. There's a lot of procurement and supply going on within that space. So in 2012, I moved to Oando PLC as the attorney within the group for mergers and acquisition and finance. And I've moved around, worked in a number of roles within the Oando group between 2012 and now. Now I render, advisory services to the new business initiatives and projects at the group level, amongst other things. My career over the last 15 years, it's been an interesting one with, tasks ranging from the mundane, like, writing letters to a government agency. I recall in 2009, I had to travel to Anambra State for the first time. Anambra and actually Abia states in about 2 or 3 days. I visited about 4 states trying to conduct some property perfection work. And, all that work that you could term as basic day-to-day legal work to closing complex transactions in the last couple of years. So in a way, jokingly, I refer to myself as the legal libero sometimes, and libero is also my nickname. So, and it means sweeper. For those of you that watch football, you understand what I mean. Doing the dirty job and the heavy lifting. So that's me. I would like to, sound a caveat that this session is just to create some sort of awareness and legal advice, and insight into legal contracting and deal making, and it's not particularly meant to be an alternative or a replacement for the legal advice or the full legal advice that you will get from a law firm, for instance. And I would also like to say that a lot of the things that you'll be hearing in this session, especially for those of you that are lawyers, will sound very familiar already. But for those that are not lawyers, I know there will be a lot of non-lawyers listening to this session as well. I would like you to, strap your seatbelt on and enjoy the session. Um, I will be taking you through what a contract means, which, like I said, is most of us are quite familiar with already. Then I'll also go into the essential elements that you would be looking out for in a valid contract, if you want to have one, and the stages involved in contracting, the contracting process, and deal making. There will be target identification, due diligence and structuring, contract origination and drafting. And of course, when I say drafting, I don't mean that we're going to have a drafting session. I'll just speak to some of the key things to look out for. And if time would permit, mention one or two clauses that that will be important to you as the one drafting the contract or as the client. Then there will be contract negotiation, which is also very key, to the process of deal making. In fact, that's one of the most important areas because even when you draft a contract, you would have to ensure that you negotiate the commercial terms and even the legal terms for the acceptance of everybody, and to protect the interest of your client. And for in-house lawyers, your employers, you always have to ensure that those clauses are properly negotiated, which is where your risk management skills will also come in. I mean, as we move along, you get to see some of the things I'm talking about. Execution of contract is pretty much administrative, so we won't dwell on that, and I would conclude, and we would go into question and answers. So that's the brief outline. Let's get into the business of the day. I will delve into what a contract is, and that's what I said. Most people are familiar with. But one thing that is important about contract is you need to know that it must involve at least two parties, and when these parties are getting together to discuss terms, to agree, there has to be some form of meeting of minds, which is what lawyers call consensus ad idem. And when that meeting of mind happens, then you can say that there's an intention to create legal relations between the parties, and that's when the contract will be legally enforceable. So a gentleman's agreement, like people call it in social circles, or a social type agreement, would not typically be enforceable because we would not have some of those requirements or elements that we get to see as we move along, this discourse. Now, there are certain requirements that should be present in all contracts. We'll get to see that as we go along as well. And, in every day-to-day relations, business relations, you would find contracts that tend to range from the simple to the hybrid ones that are 50% simple, 50% complex, and you will find a really complex agreement. So in the day-to-day activities of or responsibilities of a lawyer like me, you would find this type of agreements coming up every day. And that's what contracting is all about. So the simple type of contracts, for instance, you could have service level agreements or service agreements, as they call this in different climes. Then you could have that's to provide service to the person that is engaging, an entity that is engaging a vendor, for instance, or you have a supply and installation agreement for hardware, for equipment, for projects that you want to do, and you could be on both sides. You could be the vendor or you could be the supplier. You can also have confidentiality agreements that would seek to protect information that is exchanged, between two parties for a duration, particularly when there's a potential transaction or there's a deal that is about to be struck. You want to be sure that within a particular period, all your proprietary information, details of your business, trade secrets are protected in the confidentiality agreement. So those are basic agreements and sponsorship agreements for those that are in the charity space, and for those that are in the media and advertising and maybe event space, and they will seek to, most times want to sign sponsorship agreement. Those are the simple type of agreements. There are some that are hybrid, like when you go into IT, you see software license agreement. Depending on the type of software, it could be very complex, and it could also be very straightforward hardware supply and installation agreement, for instance. The really complex agreements are when you go into real project structuring or acquisition of interest in entities and conglomerates. You call those ones the project financing type agreement. You have SPAs and sales and purchase agreement, and some very complex shareholders agreements that will regulate the acquisition of interest in an entity, and also how parties will continue to deal with each other after or post the acquisition. Then you'd have engineering, procurement, and construction contracts. When you have massive construction projects that will require that. You have financing agreements where you take loans from banks, and those are of different types. We are not going to go into all that detail today, but I mean, as we go along, you will get to address some of these points. You have JVAs, joint venture agreements, JOAs. Those are the more complex and farm out agreements. Farm out agreement that you typically would have in oil and gas in the energy sector. So, having explained the type of contracts that we have, we would go on to continue to look into what the essential elements of those contracts are. Like I said, for the lawyers, this is basic contracts 101, but it could be a refresher as well. But I won't dwell too much on this point. Now, for you to even start to get into, say that you want to have a contract, there has to be an offer on the table. So one party needs to make an offer to another party, or a group of parties, or a group of people that will constitute different parties. Now, the person that is engaging or that is providing the offer has to put it most times in writing, even though you could have it, orally as well. But preferably, for the purpose of enforceability and reference, future reference, it's always good to have your contract in writing. So that's the offeror. That's the person that makes the offer. Then you give it to another person who is the offeree. And that's the person that is expected to, consider the offer, review the content of the offer and all the terms. So if I give you an offer as the offeror and you are the offeree, if you accept the offer, fine and simple, then we'll move on to the next point. But if you decide to vary the terms of the offer and you send it back to me, then that first offer falls off. So you have now become the offerer, the offeree that will accept. I'm trying not to use those technical language too much so that it doesn't confuse one. But it just means that the initial offer falls off, then there's a new offer on the table. For me, that was the original person that presented the offer. Now become the person that is accepting your own counter offer now. So if we get into a meeting of minds and I say, now I agree with you, this 350,000 offer that you have on the table for the purchase of this building, I accept it and I would pay on so date. So that takes us to acceptance. So the power of acceptance shifts to me as the new offeree. Sorry, so I received the offer. So there's an acceptance power to me. So that shifts to me. Now you can accept the offer the same way it was written to you, with the terms and conditions that will create a binding contract. And the acceptance must be from the person that the offer was sent to. If another person is doing it on behalf of somebody else, then it has to be clear and express instructions for you to accept an offer on behalf of someone else. So no third person is allowed to do that because the offer was sent to another person. So acceptance would be in the manner in which the offer came to you in the first place. So when you have offer and you have acceptance, you've met one of the two main conditions, essential elements of a valid contract. Now, one fundamental thing that differentiates a contract from a gentleman's agreement, for instance, or just a gift, which may not make it enforceable, if it's just a gift or a gentleman's agreement, which will not make it enforceable in court, is that you need to have provided consideration. Consideration is a word that can be used in different ways. It could mean price, it could mean fee for some types of contract, for service contracts, for instance, you call it fee, but there has to be an underlying benefit that flows from one party to the other party. So I'm parting with benefit. I'm parting with something that will probably give me benefits. So if I give you money and you're meant to give me service in return, that means I've paid you for that. So there's already consideration flowing between two parties. There's always that question: what is in it for me? And that's probably the question that you ask on consideration. So consideration gives it that third element, essential element, for it to be a valid contract. And consideration does not necessarily have to be, adequate, sufficient. There are contracts that have nominal consideration. They call it nominal consideration. It could just be $1, and you're wondering, why am I buying this property for $1? It could be in exchange for something else that is not captured within the precincts of that particular contract. But it is, as long as it's sufficient for the person that is receiving it and is bargained for value, then there is a consideration and that contract is enforceable. Right. So, and you should ensure that your consideration is not vague. or meaningless. So there has to be clarity and certainty, as to the consideration, even though it doesn't have to be adequate, but it has to be sufficient. So moving from there, we would go into the intention to create a binding contract. What are the four major elements of of a valid contract? Actually, the four major elements. So there are about two or three other ones that are not going to be very relevant to this discourse, or we won't go into all that detail. So, if you talk about intention to create a binding contract, you would say that that is what gives that contract enforceability. And that's why some contracts are not enforceable. And as we go along, we'll talk into detail about MOUs and term sheets and the likes. I'm sure you must have heard about MOUs in your day-to-day, contractual relationship with people, or your day-to-day work. Memorandum of understanding. Let's sign an MOU. Let's sign an MOU. How binding is an MOU? Does it create an intention to be binding on both parties? We'll get to see that as we move along as well. So, in the absence of intention to create legal, relations, you typically see that a contract is just a mere promise. It's just a mere promise. It's not a valid or a binding contract, like a handshake or a gentleman's agreement, for instance. Um, like I said, we shouldn't dwell too much on essential elements. So those are apart from that, you also have capacity to actually contract, which is very important. So maybe I should touch on it as well. You would There are some people that cannot enter into contracts, even if they sign that contract by virtue of their capacity or incapacity. They are not allowed to enter into a contract. Those contracts may not be enforceable against them. So you may think that you already signed a contract and everything is kosher, but by the end of the day, the enforceability is key to a contract. There's no point having a worthless piece of paper. Capacity of the parties is very, very important. Like for instance, minors, people under 18 years are not expected or are not allowed to enter into contracts except maybe through their authorized guardian or their parents or something. So they are not permitted to enter into a contract. Then, illiterates are not generally, able to sign a contract. People that would understand their rights, for instance, may not be able to enter validly into a contract, except maybe they sign what lawyers call a jurat, which would say that, the terms of this document have been read to me in the language I understand, and I hereby agree that this contract, should be signed on my behalf, or I'm signing this contract myself. So that's for illiterates, or maybe intoxicated people that are under the intake of drugs or alcohol. They cannot validly contract. And also, where you cannot you cannot sign a contract by yourself, there's also the power of attorney that you could give to another individual to do that on your behalf. So capacity is very key in execution of contracts. Now, we've taken the rudiments, the basics, the essential elements of a valid contract. We would then start moving into the more practical steps, in contracting. And this gets more interesting because varies across board, depending on the type of contract that you're executing. Simple contracts, for instance, may not have some of these bogus words or explanation that I will give as we move along the next couple of 10 minutes, the next 10 minutes, for instance, couple of minutes. But there's a thread that runs through the entire contracting process, whether simple, hybrid, or complex, like I've explained in the beginning. So you would start by trying to identify the target, and in some cases, for simple contract, the subject matter. So, for instance, you want to supply of furniture to your office. Now, the furniture, which is the product that is meant to be supplied to the office, is your target. That is the subject matter. You would typically use, or maybe you want to appoint a vendor to do that. Then you have to select the vendor. The process actually involves identifying the need for the contract. Why do I need to enter into this contract? What problem am I seeking to solve by entering into the contract? Am I trying to procure items I use? Am I trying to acquire land for building an office or a house, for instance? Or am I trying to do something bigger, acquiring a company or the shares, in a company, as it were? So all that process or the reason behind acquisition would determine how you are going to structure your contracting and the transaction. And like I said, we'll get to see more of that as we continue to go on. So you have to take certain steps that would include finding out what your target is about, doing your research, and establishing requirements before you even start. For supply type contracts, for instance, your procurement guys, they will look at, for a company, the procurement guys will look at the vendors to engage, you go through the contract and the bid process, identify the vendor to provide that service. For bigger projects like acquisition, mergers and acquisitions, you would find that the process for identifying a target may even involve, engaging a consultant to look into two or three buckets of ideas or targets, then picking the one that feels like the best line of action for the company to derive that revenue drive that it is on. So you can have a list of potential qualified suppliers or targets identified, and there's pre-qualification to pick one of those targets. So once you've identified your target and you see some prospects on that or in that target or on the project, you can move on to the next stage, which is very, very important. Most people run into problems because they end up signing agreements or signing contracts or entering into transactions without conducting due diligence on that transaction. And maybe a more relatable point would be to speak about, I always go back to acquisition of land because everybody can relate to that. So you find a plot of land somewhere in Lagos, and I'm speaking from Lagos. So you find a plot of land somewhere in Lagos, and you like the location so much, the land goes for maybe 20 million naira, and you have the money, and you intend to buy the property, but you don't want to engage a lawyer. And this is not me advertising for anybody or any lawyer, but I'm just telling you that you have something that you do, that's your area of expertise. Due diligence and legal due diligence and every other type of due diligence is somebody else's expertise. So you can outsource that part of that, work to someone else to carry out, so that you get the benefit and you protect yourself against the risks that are involved. So you go ahead, you pay for the land because it's so beautiful. You like the location, like nice area, but you don't get to check whether the land is within an area that is within government acquisition, or you don't get to check at the lands registry whether somebody else has already placed a lien on the property and you pay, but somebody has an overriding interest on that land. Due diligence is very, very important, and it allows buyers of anything to fully understand what the risks are, how to mitigate those risks, and what probably the encumbrance is. When I say encumbrances to the non-lawyers, it means restrictions that have been placed on that property that you shouldn't even go near it at all. Or if there's a remedy, those remedies have to be in place before you should actually pay for that property or for that target item. So due diligence is important. There's legal due diligence where you're checking, and governance due diligence, you're checking, existing agreements. Maybe there's a loan that has been taken by the owner of the assets and has used the asset for security or collateral, or if it's a company, the company has places shares to certain lenders that you're not aware of. So you have to do a detailed legal governance. You have to check the company's constitutional documents. You have to check whether the company is empowered to sign the agreement. You have to check whether there's capacity, which I've talked about earlier, before you go into the contracting process at all. And the question that you would have ask yourself would be that, is this a deal that I should be going into? And the report of your due diligence would show that. I'm stressing the due diligence because that's the first step to actually determining whether you have a contract, a prospective or a potential contract that you should be going into in the first place. And for confidentiality purposes, companies will typically not disclose, every detail of their operations to every company that expresses an interest. So you would have to go in and ask the right questions, and that's where due diligence comes in. Allows you to gain insight into the targets, people, the company, the parties involved, because the individuals could also be exposed to be politically exposed people that you do not want to do business with, for one reason or the other. Or they could just be people that are subject to, or entities that are subject to certain sanctions, especially for multi jurisdictional, transactions cross border transactions. So you have to be sure that you're checking all those things properly before you go into those transactions. I mean, due diligence was so important that I recall that in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, there's a quote that says, "I like not fair terms and a villain's mind." So even at that, and that was written in as far back as 1605. So you can imagine how long ago due diligence has been in the picture, and up till now, it is still very relevant, because the devil himself knoweth not what is the mind of every individual. So you have to probe and probe and probe until you're satisfied that you can take that. So there's a due diligence review process that throws up a lot of information, on the target company or the contract that you want to go into. And the fundamental questions would be: can the deal still go ahead? Should it go ahead without, certain set of covenants that will protect my interest? I've found and so negative issues, but I still want to go ahead with this deal. Are these deal breakers? Can I just find a way to probably get warranties from the other side to say that if so happens, I'm going to get and so you indemnify me for this, indemnify me for that, you pay me for this if I end up having a bad deal. So you have to weigh all those options before you actually go into your transaction. And if there are concerns that you need to raise that can be remedied or fixed by the target company or the guy on the other side, I think that this would be a very good time to raise those concerns. So there's a whole process of going into the phase for due diligence, but I would spare us that detail for today. Then after let's assume you have a due diligence report and it's positive, then you have to go into structuring the transaction. Why does structuring matter? Because it actually it gives you, it's like a peep into the future. It's what shows you how you are going to, what rights and obligations you have in the project, and how you are going to structure the transaction in such a way that you're going to get the full benefits, commercial benefits, and the terms that will be, in the agreements that you end up signing at a later period. So that's why deal structuring matters. There are so many moving parts in a business, right? So if you do not have a codified structure that parties want to adopt going into that deal, then you will end up, running left, right, and center. And at the end of the day, you may miss out critical issues that should be, or critical items or points that should be put in place to ensure that you get the maximum benefits from that transaction. And when you're talking about structuring, that's the point where you also need to agree on some commercial terms. What structure type are we using? This is going to be an asset sale, assuming you are going into M&A, mergers and acquisition. You want to acquire interest in an entity, or you just want to buy an asset. So you could buy an asset, or you could buy the shares in the company that own the asset. In which case you're acquiring the entire company and you're owning the asset as well. But if you feel like the company is not clean enough for you to acquire all the interest in that company, and you just want to strip the company of that asset and just buy one of the assets of the company and put it under your own control, or your own bucket of assets, then an asset sale, would be better for you. And there are some other benefits that come from asset sale, because it's more defined, and you have like a sale and purchase agreement to define what you're getting from that asset sale. There's less risk to the buyer of taking unknown liabilities, like I said, when you're doing an asset sale, because you're just buying the assets in its form, that you can decide to invest money to improve the assets. And it's clear the things you're buying. But if you do a share sale, for instance, and I'm not saying share sales are bad. In fact, share sales are even better, because you even get capital gains tax savings on share sale. But if it's a share sale, you're buying the entire business, including the assets, the liabilities, the intellectual property, and all the fixed properties of the company, like land, like building, machinery, and some other heavy equipment. So that's when you do a share sale. You buy at the corporate level. You're buying the shares of the company that owns the variety of assets. So it's a more detailed due diligence process that you have to do when you're doing a share sale. And sometimes, I mean, depending on how massive the target is, it could be simpler for the business, for you, because it's sold in full as a going concern. So you just buy the whole bulk and you move. But for more complex company structures, for conglomerates, share sales can be more tedious and expensive. But like I said, you get to reap some of the capital allowances, some of the tax savings from capital gains tax on share sale, as compared to an asset sale where you have to pay CGT to government. So there's tax savings on that and cost savings as well. So structuring tells you what the duration would look like, what the pricing or consideration. I've talked about consideration and pricing. It tells you what it would look like. And for simple contracts, you may want to structure your payment terms. Are you doing 70/30 in advance? Are you paying? Are you giving 70% in return for an APG, an advance payment guarantee, that the vendor has to procure from his bank, or a bank guarantee? Then once the project is completed and then certificate of completion, then you can pay the balance. There are default obligations, default terms, repayment terms, particularly for loan agreements and financing agreement, etc. So you have to, at that point in time, start to look at what the structure would look like. And that's when you look at all these clauses, some of the clauses that I've mentioned. And I mean, you can also have a merger between two companies, and that would subsume that company into one or two businesses that would become one new entity under a new name, or maybe an existing name that would, like the Access Bank and Diamond merger, for instance. But due diligence is important, whatever structure you decide to approach, or to adopt. Sorry. So when you have a deal, what structure is best? I think it depends, like I said, on what you're seeking to achieve from the transaction, and the expectations of both the buyer and the seller, for instance. But you have to find a structure that would work for both parties. When we get to negotiation, we'll talk about of contract. Then we'll talk about what how to put the deal through, and the skills that you need for that process to happen. Now, hope I'm doing well with time. So we have contract origination and drafting. That's the next one. So that's when you talk about the real devil in the detail, right? Lawyers handle contracting like every day of their lives. In fact, 60% of what lawyers do is documentation. Whether you're going to court, whether you're trying to close transactions, etc. So I believe that drafting is very, very important, and you have to make sure that you draft your contract in such a way that you mitigate risk, and it's clear, it's concise, and that will give clients confidence as well. You could use a template. Most lawyers work on templates that they've already prepared, or that they find in different places, but you have to ensure that the template is not just adopted like you find some companies do. You have to suit it to your needs. So there's a lot of work that goes into ensuring that you word your document carefully and protect the interest of your client or organization. You you then get into that process of drafting the preliminary document, which is the MOU or the term sheet. Generally, MOUs, term sheets are stated to be indicative. They're not binding on both parties, but they set the tone to get into the transaction. So you have them say, this is indicative, parties have agreed to come together and agree this preliminary point, but they are not enforceable, except they are stated as enforceable in the document. That's when you now create an intention to be bound by those documents. An MOU will typically tell you general conditions that will be built upon in another document that's called definitive agreement. But a term sheet goes into more detail as to what will be contained in the main document. So you typically find, that in the term sheet. I'm trying to race against time now. So some of the very important clauses in contract that you also need to take advantage of, that you need to take notice of, will be the force majeure clause. COVID came and the whole world changed, and now you find that we found that during COVID that there were a lot of contracts that were frustrated, and people had to come back to the table to renegotiate a lot of contracts, particularly because COVID could not let the performance of those contracts continue. So that's the important clause in your agreement. That's one of the important clauses that you have to put in your definitive agreement, force majeure clause, because it addresses issues such as act of God, wars, terrorism. You can see what's going on in Nigeria now. A lot of contracts would have been frustrated by now because of the flooding in the east and the south. I'm sure the people that have entered into those contracts, they're already looking to ways to declare a force majeure. And of course, we know that even within the oil and gas sector, there's been a lot of force majeure declaration with offshore terminals by companies like Shell, Focados, and Scrabbles, etc. So you have to make sure that these clauses are there to protect you in this event. And of course, there will always be disputes, and that's why contracts are crafted to ensure that dispute resolution clauses are watertight. And when you have to invoke those clauses, there's no form of ambiguity as to the venue, as to the applicable law, as to the type of dispute resolution mechanism that you're going to use, whether it's arbitration or litigation, etc. So those two clauses are very, very important. In the interest of time, I wouldn't be able to go too deep into that. So I talked about devil in the detail. This is also something that was traced back to many years ago, like the Shakespeare example I gave. It only means that you have to be as detailed as possible in preparing your documentation in relation to what we're talking about. But literally, it just means that small things, plans. When you make a plan on the surface, it looks very simple, but when you examine them closely, it's not as simple as they look. So, and that's what lawyers do on a daily basis. There's a devil in the detail. So you have to ensure that as you're working, you are drafting documents that reflect a significant amount of thought process that's gone into it and attention to detail. You have to be meticulous about it because your document is what speaks to you for you, even when you are not there. So that gives you confidence with the clients and ensures that you have credibility even with opponents. For those of us that go to court, litigation lawyers, when you see certain documents in court, you know that this is the law firm that drafted it. So drafting is very important for lawyers. I have something on contract negotiation and deal making tips, but I think it would pop up when I go into answering the questions. And I think I would jump into that right now in the interest of time again. And I would say, thank you for listening to this part of the session. I know that there are certain questions that are already coming up, and I'll just scroll through them and see what the questions are. Okay, I can see a question that says, aside from the obvious requirements, what skills would you say are needed to succeed as a legal expert in the energy industry. Okay, so I'll try as much as possible not to talk about the obvious ones. Of course, you have to be a good lawyer. That's one. You have to know your law, right? That's very obvious. Because as an oil and gas lawyer, you're going to be working on a diverse, range of complex projects and commercial contracts. So you have to ensure that you're able to simplify even the complex things to the to enable you advise your commercial business partners and your senior executives um, in such a way that they are confident going ahead with the transaction even without looking at the document. So you have to build that trust that once my lawyer looks at it and he advises me on what I should do, then I can go to sleep basically, or I can take the step, a bold step, and sign the agreement. There are some most companies, or there are some companies that when you have trusted lawyers, the CEO or the directors that are meant to sign those documents would never sign without the lawyers looking at the documents, and that's to show you the importance of lawyers, even outside the energy space generally. Um, you also need to have very strong risk management skills because that's what you do basically. You're trying to protect your company from future exposures, risks that would expose the company and would probably lead to capital erosion or erosion of profit if everything goes bad. So you're making sure that this is an important skill that you hone as you move around or as you move along in your career, even as an energy law practitioner, because energy law projects are very capital intensive. Energy projects are very capital intensive, and a small mistake can lead to billions of naira or millions of dollars. So you have to be able to spot those risks in the contract and ensure that they are mitigated. Another very important skill that you need to have is, we've talked about it, commercial negotiation skills. Um, Part of the things that you need to do to negotiate a deal would be to ensure that at every point in time, you are very conscious of what your priorities are when you are negotiating. You have to prioritize the points that you need to make that you feel. So you have a priority list and you say, this point, one, two, three are my deal breakers. I can't allow this to go, but I can compromise on three, four, five. Then you start with the ones that are priority to you. And by the time you are negotiating, you know what your top priorities are. And these are like usually the business and money making opportunities that you would that the deal would offer. And you have to know how the other deals rank below that. For instance, if you have a difficult JV partner, in the joint, when I say JV, I mean a joint venture. And in a joint venture and you have a difficult JV partner, and you're trying to negotiate a compromise or a deal with that JV partner, what do you think would be your priority? Is it going to be negotiating, buying out the entire interest of the JV partner so that you are in full control of the company, or gaining a significant control of part of the shares of the JV partner? If you do the latter, it means that you still have that person in the business, and it can continue to frustrate all the plans, all the programs that you have for that particular business. So when you're negotiating, you have to prioritize those things that you feel, based on revenue and risk, you cannot afford to leave them hanging. Then I think another thing to negotiate with properly is to use the offer and concession strategy. Don't be too eager to make offers to the other party. Make sure that the other side leaves the negotiation feeling like they've made a good deal, whereas they probably gotten the shorter end of the stick. It's a tip for negotiating transactions. You always need to leave some room, to make acceptable concessions to the other side. So that's the only way. Like I know one businessman usually says that the most important trip you can make or you can take in life is meeting people halfway. So you have to do offer concession. So it's the carrot, stick and carrot approach. I give you this, I get this. I drop this, you give me this. But whilst you're doing that, you have to ensure that those you're dealing with there are a lot of other styles that you can use. I think I'll probably even touch on one or two other ones by the time I answer comes up again in some other questions. I think I've answered that first one. I can see another one that speaks to what's the most fun aspect of your job. If you could change anything about it, what would that be? Hmm. So I think for me, right, is the fact that I said at the beginning of this session, it's been, I think the legal profession is a very interesting one. Um, Sometimes I wouldn't lie to you, and the lawyers on the session will tell you that it's not fun at all, particularly because of the number of hours that you have to put in. But if you love what you do, you feel the impact that you're making, right? Which is probably the fun aspect for me, the spontaneity that comes with each day when you wake up. There are days that you wake up and you're coming to work and you've listed one, two, three, four items that you're going to do, and you realize that by 5 o'clock that same day, you've only done one or none of those three things. Why? Because other things came up, and those things are life-threatening events for the company. So it's that spontaneity that comes that keeps you going every day. And before you look up and you realize that you've done 15 years, or you've done 10 years on the job or in a company, and you don't know that, especially because there's also some other fun aspects of the job that may not be as demanding or tedious as reviewing a 500-page document, for instance. So it's a very interesting. What would I change if I had my way? Hmm. I think for me, it would be that the ability to the expectations that you have, particularly with the people that you work with, the guys on the commercial side. If you could let them see reason why you're taking some of the decisions that you take or some of the positions that you take when advising them. And like I said, if you're a trusted lawyer, they will listen to you more. So you need to create that trust. So it's getting maybe more time to let them see, your side of the story, and probably even convince them. All right. So we have another question that speaks to a very specific way to get a win-win in deal making. Yeah, I think there is in deal. So one of the ways that I think you can get a win-win is to manage outcome expectations, right? So you have to ensure that prior to and during negotiations, people develop that people develop expectations about the type of deal they receive going into a meeting, for instance. So as a negotiator, um, whether as a commercial negotiator or as a lawyer, you should be able to compare the eventual outcome of the meeting or that negotiation process with what they expected prior to negotiating. And that would make it easy for you to be able to meet them in the middle. So you can manage the expectations of their expectation on the outcome of the negotiation. One common negotiation mistake that people make that sabotages the win-win situation, for instance, is to hurriedly accept an offer or make it look like you are willing to make concessions at the beginning. At an early stage, you have to hold your cards close to your chest. Even if you plan that 15 naira is what you're going to buy that property, you know that that's your base price. You don't go to 15 naira or 14 naira or even 13 naira until you realize that the other guy is coming closer to you. Because once you make that move and you go close to your base price, the guy believes that he can always get concessions from you, and you end up getting the shorter end of the stick. So you have to make the other party also feel like they've gotten a good deal out of it. Whereas, they probably have even been Another question that speaks to second. My problem with due diligence with lawyers is the cost. Why does it have to be a percentage of the cost of the property? Hmm. And what is my question to you is what is the price of not of what is the price of not paying that cost? Probably the entire value of that property that you want to buy. You could lose everything. So do you want to weigh that price against what you stand to lose in event that you refuse to pay that, and it's negotiable. And I think lawyers are very flexible when it comes to pricing, except the lawyer insists on his value and he knows what is given to you, which in most cases you would have to pay because you want to go ahead with that due diligence process. So I think it's better for you to um, pay that cost if you can, because it protects you against the exposures or the risk. And that's the work of a lawyer, by the way. I mean, from experience, you can tell where the risk, where the hot spots are, and you can quickly mitigate those risks by carrying out your due diligence process. Would you ask parties to choose court or arbitration in the settlement of their disputes? Now it depends, right? Different types of agreements come with different, dispute resolution clauses, or the different dispute resolution clauses or procedures work better for different types of agreements. If you have a confidentiality agreement, for instance, right? As much as arbitration is fashionable, and you may want to go to an arbitral venue or arbitrators to resolve it, you may need to look at the nature of that agreement and what the orders would be like. So information is already spilled. Confidentiality has been compromised. Now you want to get damages, right? And the damages are awarded. It's easier enforced in court than maybe by an arbitral panel. I know the ADR disputes resolution people, the arbitrators on the call will probably smile, but sometimes instrumentality of the court for certain type of agreements makes it more suited for the adversarial, for the court system. And also you could have arbitration as a preferred clause when the dispute is cross border or multi jurisdictional, because you have another party that is in the UK, you have a Nigerian party, and you guys want to argue, or you have a dispute. Um, the person in the UK doesn't want Nigerian law to be the applicable law and doesn't want to come to Nigerian courts because he's not sure what the legal system here is and how fast it can be resolved. Because I mean, it's all over the news that Nigerian judicial system grinds slowly. So the person will probably prefer to do arbitration instead, which will be faster. Whether it's cheaper is a discussion for another day, but it's always faster, and it's always faster than most times faster than the court. It could also be very complex sometimes, or mediation can also be a very faster way of resolving. So it depends on all those intricacies or ramifications. So that decision has to be made. So you need to also consult a lawyer that can advise you. If an MOU or SLA or confidentiality agreement is drafted by me using a template I have, does it mean that it's not legally binding if something goes wrong or one has to go to court? Would you ask parties to choose court or arbitration? Okay, so that's like a follow up. So, yeah, the fact that it's drafted by you using a template does not mean that it's not binding. As long as the other party signs, it just means that you may be oblivious of some of the important clauses that you should have highlighted or changed because you are not a lawyer and you cannot foresee some of the risks that would be, ahead. Um, but you can still have an agreement. But the question is, if a lawyer reads it and redrafts it for you, you are going to see from the language that will be in the agreement, from all the clauses that you forgot to include, that could have been included to protect. Remember, I said that each agreement is dependent on what parties are trying to achieve and nature of the transaction. So there's no one single rule that's all for agreements. It depends on what the party. So I mean, advisedly, I think it's better for you to engage the expert when it's time to draft an agreement. At what point can a contract be referred to as fully executed? A contract is fully executed when all the parties, starters, when two parties are involved, when both of them have signed, it is fully executed. If there are many parties from three upwards, then it would not be binding on the party that has not executed the contract. And it would not even be fully executed until all the parties to that contract have signed. But you can also have, signatures in counterparts, which means that if both parties are not in the same location, one party can sign one copy and transmit it to the other party. Then you can have counterpart signature on the other side as well. Then they put it together as one single contract. But it's always good to have that clause in the contract that speaks to counterpart signature for stability. Must all contract agreements be written? That's another question. The answer is no. Contract, I mean, if it's a contract agreement, right, you would expect that it should be written as a requirement. But you can have oral contracts and you can also have implied contracts. By your actions, by your words, you could have created, and by your actions, you create a contract orally, and by payments for that service, for instance, you're already creating, or delivery or performance by the other side, there's already an implied contract, even though there's nothing in writing. So that's what I mean by no. There are contracts that can be, what are the most popular type of issues that you have to deal with in your field? Managing financial obligations, particularly in loan agreements, lender engagements. I mean, I work for a company, so you always have to engage your lenders. I mean, that's in conjunction with your treasury or your commercial team. So you have managing, for instance, a default situation under a particular agreement. I mentioned COVID before. There are insecurities everywhere in the country, and that's also leading to capital or revenue erosion, and companies are generally finding it difficult to service their loans. So you'll be trying to negotiate a reduction in interest rates or your extension of repayment terms, etc., moratorium, etc. So you can do a contractual breach. You have vendors breaching their contracts at different times, non-performance and those issues. So you have to always, review the contract and ensure that, termination documents are issued or letters are drafted and issued. So such issues. Then you also have to balance internally your legal prescriptions with what the commercial aspirations of your company is. So you have to always find ingenious ways of creating value for your clients and also for for those that are working in-house, your internal clients. Also balancing deadlines as well. Deadlines are, they say the deadlines the biggest motivation. So you always have to ensure that you are right on time with projects. Sometimes you can get really busy and swamped and it becomes very difficult. Not sure if I still have enough time. I think I have like 1 minute left. Let me see if I can squeeze in one quick question. But if I can't, then I'll just leave it here. I mean, there will always be opportunity to engage. You could send emails, you could send a message, you could catch up on any of the social media platforms and have further discussions on some of the things that we've discussed earlier, and we can talk into detail on some of these things. I hope I've been able to manage the time well. There's still a lot to talk about. Just that time won't permit. So at this point in time, I would say it's been a good ride. It's been worthwhile. Speaking to you and getting to share some of the things that I know working as a lawyer in the last couple of years. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining the session. I hope to see you some other time. Thank you.